Exploring North Carolina is made possible by major financial support from the Friends of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, the largest natural history museum in the Southeast, and a major center for education and research in the natural sciences. Let it be your field guide to the treasures of North Carolina and beyond. By a continuing grant from DTS Software, Mainframe Storage Management Solutions, and by UNC-TV viewers like you.
The Roman Colosseum and other structures of the Roman Empire are about 2,000 years old. The pyramids and the Great Sphinx of Egypt were built between 4,000 and 4,500 years ago. The famous Stonehenge monument in England is approximately 5,100 years old. But what about the ancient history of the people of the Carolinas? It is a long and important history that predates the pyramids by 8,000 years.
Carefully cradled in my arms is a portion of a tusk from a mastodon. This specimen was found near Goldsboro, North Carolina. Between 10 and 12,000 years ago, 3 kinds of elephants roamed the Carolinas. At the same time, man entered the picture. These 2 spectacular spear points were also found in North Carolina. This found near Baden, and this one found in Raleigh. These were made by Paleo-Indians, the ancestors of today's Native Americans. And that's our story today, man and mammoth in the Carolinas.
Before looking at the first people, who we now call Paleo-Indians, we need to look at the climate, animals and plants following the last ice age in what is now North Carolina. For a fascinating glimpse into the past, I visited with Dr. Dale Russell, Senior Paleontologist of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. I asked Dale to describe this region between 12 and 20,000 years ago.
The astonishing thing to me about the late Pleistocene, or roughly 20,000 years ago, when the glacial development in North America was at its greatest, the geography of North Carolina was practically the same then as it is now. This seems intuitively impossible, but it was. All of the mountains, all of the peaks, all of the valleys would have been virtually exactly the same as they are now. The river courses have been here for over 150 million years, and they wouldn't have changed much during the Pleistocene. The rivers would have been immediately recognizable, even to the contour of the valleys and everything. It would have been the same. The same thing for the coastal plain, especially the upper coastal plain. All the sites of future cities and everything would be clearly identifiable, no problem. And when we were walking around in North Carolina, in natural North Carolina, The butterflies, the grasshoppers, all of the insects, so far as we know, it have been precisely the same and easily identifiable. The same goes for the salamanders, the frogs, the lizards, the turtles, the snakes. All of the herpetofauna and all of the small mammals would have been the same too. So a naturalist in North Carolina 20,000 years ago would have been able to identify everything that was small and everything that was green. One thing was absolutely amazingly different, and that is about 300 miles north of the North Carolina-Virginia border, there was an ice sheet covering North America that was equal to the size of the Antarctic ice sheet today, just 300 miles away. That's where we are approximately from the edge of the continental ice sheet. That ice sheet had consumed so much water from the oceans, taken out so much water that sea level during the late glacial maximum was 400 feet below what it is now.
I asked Tyler Clark, head of the North Carolina Geological Survey, how this drop in sea level would have affected North Carolina's coastline.
At the peak of the last ice age, about 18,000 years ago, sea level was 425 feet lower than it is now, and the North Carolina coastline was as far as 60 miles east of its present location. During this time, the Outer Banks didn't exist at all, and Albemarle and Pamlico Sound were miles from the coast.
Paleo-Indians living in the locations of present-day Wilmington or Nag's Head around 12,000 years ago would have been about 30 miles inland and 125 feet above sea level. 10,000 years ago, the sea would still have been 90 feet below current levels. Just 7,000 years ago, the difference was still 45 feet. During these times, the present-day Pamlico and Albemarle Sounds would have been inland and part of the coastal plain. Dr. Russell described another major difference between then and now.
From a technical point of view, most people consider a 5-kilogram animal or a 12-pound animal as a big animal, because most of the mammals of the earth are that size or smaller. So that we think of a deer or we think of a bear as a big animal. Well, between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, or 11,500 depending, there were a lot of animals that would be called megafauna, and we ordinarily think of megafauna as animals like larger than a deer or larger than a bear, something that is really big. So what characterizes North Carolina 15,000 years ago was a great abundance of huge herbivores, so that we had giant bison, we had at least 2 different kinds of horses, we had tapirs, pretty husky-looking animals, you know, they're compactly made. We had 2 different kinds of hogs, wild hogs here. My goodness, we had camels, we had sloths, and some of the ground sloths were absolutely huge. They're probably in the range of small elephants, i.e. 3-ton animals, and they're all over North Carolina. The thing that really is spectacular, as far as I can see from my point of view, is we had 3 different kinds of elephants in North Carolina. Now an elephant goes about 5 metric tons, 4 to 5 to 6 metric tons, depending on how large an animal we're dealing with. We had prairie mammoths, we had woolly mammoths, and we had mastodons, which lived in forests. In Africa today, we have only one kind of elephant, of course, but in North Carolina we had another megafauna that was dominated by elephants. They were all over the place, and in Africa today we think of maybe 4 or 5 different kinds of large carnivores. In North Carolina we had 2 kinds of saber cats. We had an American lion, and all these animals were bigger than the African lion. We had cougars, of course, then as now. So we had 4 different kinds of big cats. We had big dogs, a big dire wolf that was bigger than anything in Africa. I think we would literally fear for our lives if we went for a stroll in the North Carolina woods or the North Carolina prairie at that time. So our Paleo-Indian progenitors were courageous, and they had to cope with a lot that we've forgotten how to cope with. One of the more surprising things I think about North Carolina during an ice age, did you ever think of Ice Age North Carolina inhabited by alligators and giant turtles? There's a non sequitur there. Something's wrong with that picture. And this is another one of the astonishing things. We had big alligators and we had huge turtles in North Carolina when there were glaciers 300 miles away. So the alligators are still here, but unfortunately I think the turtles went into the pot. And because they were large and they had a lot of flesh, probably the people living here at that time looked upon giant turtles in the same way that the old sailors used to look at turtles. They were good to put in the holes of ship and save for stew.
There are some important places in the museum that you may never see. One of my favorites is Level B, 2 stories underground. This is where part of the museum's permanent collection is stored. It's a paleontologist's dream. Among other things, you'll find Ice Age mammal fossils from North Carolina and the Southeast.
If you combine the large animals of Yellowstone Park and some of the animals of Africa, you can get a hint of what North Carolina was like at the end of the Pleistocene, or last ice age. Plant life was similar, but at the same time different from today.
You know, there's an interesting phenomenon that happened with the plants. They didn't react exactly like the mammals did, the giant Mega Fauna. What happened was when the glaciers were at their maximum extent, covering half of the North American continent, all the northern trees were pushed south. And the south was temperate, it was warm, but they found places where they could adapt. And so we had a mixture of spruce, pine, hemlock, mixed in with walnuts and beech, and generally southern trees, and a peculiar conglomeration of trees that enormously increased the diversity of trees living in this part of the world. Now, when the ice ages ended, the trees desegregated so that the northern species moved north. But with the plants, they didn't just move north. There were 2 options in North Carolina because we have mountains in North Carolina. So what happened was they split their distributions. Some of them went north and some of them went up the mountains of North Carolina. So that if you want to feel yourself in Ice Age North Carolina, there are lots of relic places, or I should say a few precious places, where you can see trees growing that are more typical of southern Ontario and Quebec in Canada. Here growing in North Carolina, and our museum calls these places islands in the sky. Well, we've lost the big game animals of North Carolina. They're not here anymore. What happened to them? Well, we know that about 12,000 years ago, 2 things happened. We know that people were abundant in North Carolina as they were in North America, and we know the climate changed. Now, what's happened is that we know those things, but there are a lot of details that we don't know. So, facing that kind of ignorance, you usually have a diversity of opinion. And people are passionate creatures. It's part of their charm. And the result of this has been a spirited exchange of opinion regarding the disappearance of the megafauna in North America. But I am so interested in it, and it's a wonderful time because it's really an experiment in the acquisition of knowledge, as well as finding out something very important and very interesting to the place where I live, North Carolina.
Was it the influence of man, changes in climate, or both that doomed the great animals between 10 and 12,000 years ago? Dale Russell is correct that among talented scientists there are differences of opinion. Today and for years to come, scientists will still be debating these questions. It is time now to ask another important question. How long have humans been in this region, and what was life like for them? We will be referring to the first people with terms such as Paleo-Indians, Native Americans, American Indians, or the first North Carolinians. These are all intended to be terms of honor because we are not referring to a lost or relic people. The people who walked our forests 12,000 years ago are the ancestors of American Indians living in North Carolina today. They were ingenious people, simply living in another time. Several of North Carolina's foremost archaeologists helped exploring North Carolina look at people at the end of the Ice Age. Until relatively recently, many scientists did not think that man had been in this region more than a few thousand years. Discoveries in the Yadkin River Valley changed things, as I learned from Dr. Billy Oliver, director of the Research Center of the Office of State Archaeology.
In the beginning of archaeology in this region, the antiquity of man was not particularly thought to be very great, not much more than 4,000 to 6,000 years. However, with the discoveries that were made at Hardaway and Dorshuck and Louder's Ferry, it became abundantly clear through the stratified remains, which are much like a layer cake, one layer on top of another, that coupled with radiocarbon dating, which is a scientific process to establish dates, provided information that clearly showed that human presence here had been for many thousands of years. At Hardaway, we certainly know that it's at least 12,000 years. The significance of archaeology in the Yadkin Pee River region was first brought to our attention by Dr. Francis Crone, who was an early physician that traveled the hillsides visiting people on horseback. Dr. Crone observed an abundance of spear points and arrowheads and other relics that he thought were in such abundance that he considered it amazing. Many years later, after archaeology became somewhat of an interest nationally, H.M. Dorshuck, an engineer for the Alcoa Company and also a founding member of the North Carolina Archaeological Society, brought it to the attention of Geoffrey Coe, who later would become the father of North Carolina archaeology.
The sites on the Yadkin River, excavated by Geoffrey Coe, the oldest being the Hardaway site and the other being the Dorshuck site, together produce a layer cake of human history in the southeast, beginning 12,000 years ago and covering between 8,000 and 9,000 years of human occupation. Remember, the pyramids of Egypt date back only 4,500 years. But from where did these people come? A long-accepted theory is that they came across a land bridge at the Bering Straits from Siberia about 13,500 years ago. Other scientists believe that they came as island hoppers along the Pacific coastline. It too was also many miles from its current location because of lower sea levels. Other theories have some of the earliest inhabitants coming across the Pacific or even across the North Atlantic. One of the most significant discoveries relating to early Americans was near Clovis, New Mexico. Many of the early fluted projectile points found in many parts of the U.S. are referred to as Clovis points. I asked another archaeologist friend, Dr. Stephen Davis, research archaeologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to explain how we know the ages of these layered sites and why they are not just educated guesses.
The dating of ancient remains is central to what archaeologists do, and dating can be done in one of two ways, by relative dating or by absolute dating. Now, with relative dating, the archaeologist is simply trying to order objects or archaeological cultures in time, and the way this is normally done is through stratigraphy. Now, with absolute dating, the archaeologist is trying to say that an object or a culture existed at a specific point in the past. And in the southeast at least, this is normally done with radiocarbon dating. And with radiocarbon dating, what the archaeologist does is to find charcoal in association with what he's trying to date, and then that charcoal is measured through radiocarbon dating to determine its age, and then that age is then assigned to what's associated with it.
Fire was a necessity for survival in the Paleo-Indian world for warmth and cooking. Charred remains from ancient campfires or long-buried plant and animal material can be carbon dated. I also asked him whether all scientists agree on the 12,000 to 13,000 year estimates of the human footprint in Eastern America.
How long have people been in the New World? We really don't know for sure, but archaeologists are asking this question and have been asking it for years. Most archaeologists will readily accept that man has been here at least 10, 12,000 years, maybe a little bit longer, certainly since the end of the last ice age. But some archaeologists now are claiming that they have evidence that man has been here much, much longer, say up to 30,000 years, 50,000 years. And some of these sites are not too far from North Carolina. There are sites in Virginia, sites in South Carolina, and elsewhere. Now, most archaeologists tend to take a more cautious view, and while they may be ready to accept the possibility that man has been here much longer, they're very cautious about accepting the present evidence as being irrefutable evidence that that is in fact the case.
Dr. Randy Daniel of the East Carolina University Department of Anthropology addressed the question of human origin in North America in even stronger terms.
Regardless of which view one subscribes to with respect to the origins of people in North America, I think it's safe to say that for the first time the Clovis first model is on the defensive. But gosh, it's a great time to be a North American archaeologist. There's no more an interesting question to be asked than when did the first people arrive in North America?
Daniel has demonstrated the widespread distribution of Paleo-Indians across North Carolina by tracking the location of fluted projectile points. He also notes that some Paleo-Indian history is underwater.
One way that I've been looking at Paleo-Indian archaeology in North Carolina is examining the distribution of Clovis age points across the state. To date, I've recorded some 250 fluted points from the mountains to the coastal plains. Keeping in mind that the first humans encountered very different climatic conditions in North Carolina than exist today, archaeologists are now appreciating that part of the archaeological record is now underwater on the coast. If you lower the sea level 300 feet along the North Carolina coast, you're going to expose what is now the continental shelf. So what is now underwater was dry land during the Paleo-Indian period and probably part of these early settlement patterns 10, 12, 13,000 years ago.
From Billy Oliver and Steve Davis, I learned about the earliest sites in North Carolina, but it was Randy Daniel who helped me understand the difference between archaeology and history.
One of the first distinctions I make in my archaeology classes for my students is the difference between what archaeology is and history is. Both disciplines are similar in that historians and archaeologists alike are interested in understanding what life was like in the past. The difference between the disciplines is the evidence they use to help reconstruct the past. Historians use written records, journals, diaries, newspapers accounts about some event that happened in the past. Archaeologists, for the most part, deal with that time before history, prehistory, that time for which we have no written records, we have no photographs, we have no eyewitness accounts of what happened. They do that through the material remains that were left behind by people, the artifacts, the stone tools, the pottery sherds.
Again, it is important to be reminded that although we may not know exactly how long Paleo-Indians have been here, or from where they came, they are the ancestors of American Indians today. I met with Greg Richardson, director of the North Carolina Commission on Indian Affairs.
For more than 10,000 years, like this rock, American Indians have called North Carolina home. They've hunted, they've fished here, and they've practiced certain elements of commerce in this state. According to the most recent census, North Carolina is home to the largest American Indian population east of the Mississippi River. American Indians live in Wilmington, Charlotte, Greensboro, all over the state, in every county and every city. American Indians are not just a lost or historic people. They're living and thriving among our people here in the state today.
For additional information about this or other episodes, go to these websites. Exploring North Carolina is made possible by major financial support from the Friends of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, the largest natural history museum in the Southeast, and a major center for education and research in the natural sciences. Let it be your field guide to the treasures of North Carolina and beyond. By a continuing grant from DTS Software, Mainframe Storage Management Solutions, and by UNC-TV viewers like you.